Let me open the floor directly to your questions and comments for these gentlemen. First, Dan, if you could use your microphone, press the button in front, and identify yourself for posterity.
That's a lot of things to do. I'm Dan Raviv with CBS News. Thank you very much for addressing us today. On the question of dogma, one can't know how things could be better if we added some more facets to our policy, whether thinking about our national security in the future or specifically about the Middle East. For instance, you didn't mention the Arab Spring, but you mentioned Arab governments. And so you said by your analysis, the current Arab governments, using Saudi Arabia as a prime example, wouldn't do anything different in key areas. But what about the people there? Maybe the power of the people is rising. Maybe there will be changes there. Maybe the U.S. would be seen better if we added clearly to our support for Israel also a lot of support for Arab democracy, perhaps for Palestinian aspirations, etc. Now, how did that fit into your study, please?
I think it's a good question.
Can you do this from the mic?
Oh,
So they can see you.
oh, I'm not sure that's an advantage for the for the audience, which was saying, "Let him sit, let him sit." I think that's a good question. It's a prospective question, right? It is. But the first distinction I make is between what the Arab mass thinks and what governments do. That's the criterion. And you suggest that Arab governments, because of the Arab revolt, phrase I prefer to one that adverts to the seasons, because as you know, there is no spring in Egypt, not to put too fine a point on it. But anyway, and metaphorically it also may have some problems. But anyway, back to the point. It may be in Egypt we may see a growing influence of mass opinion on Egyptian foreign policy, which would affect the United States. Not yet. Okay, so it's a theory, could happen. I think that it's highly unlikely to happen in the Gulf for a variety of reasons, which I think are self-evident. But my guess is on Egypt, my guess is that partly because of the Egyptian military, maybe even largely because of the Egyptian military, that the rhetoric may change, will change, has been changing perhaps since the revolt began, but that the policies are not likely to change very much. But it's a good reminder to keep a watching brief to see if in fact that happens. But I think in terms of American national interests, the laboratory is confined to Egypt. The laboratory is confined to Egypt and doesn't, I think, affect any other country that would have a substantial effect on our national interests.
Yes, Hillel. In the back.
Thanks, Rob. Hillel Fradkin of the Hudson Institute. My question, it's actually two. One regarding the past. You spoke of how traditionally the relationship was conceived of, but we have spoken for many years of a strategic relationship between the United States and Israel. And I was wondering how that third pillar, what place, if any, it had in that prior conception. And secondly, you made a recommendation at the very end regarding the engagement of the policy community, I guess for want of a better term, here in Washington and elsewhere, about acting on your findings and developing them. I was wondering what you thought would be the appropriate ways or ways to do that. That would be very helpful to know. Thank you.
In terms of the development of the strategic relationship? Well,
let me at least try to answer on the first one, the first part. As as I think I said, I believe that and I think our work supports this conclusion, that the United States gets a strategic benefit from the very fact of its support for Israel. Not that there aren't problems and that sort of thing. Part of this is a result of the United States not only defends its realpolitik interests, we defend our principles. But this is a case where we defend both. And I think that's true of a good many of our other security relationships. And in that sense, I think there's been a long-standing sense that the U.S.-Israel relationship is a strategic one and not simply a values one. There's also this specific point, which I think is quite important, of the contribution that Israeli capabilities make to keeping the lid on in the region, at least in terms of large-scale military operations. And that is very much in our interest, that we don't have to do that alone, that we have help from the Israelis. But I think the thing which we've tried to add in this study is that it is not a one-way street, that there are ways in which Israel does things which are in some sense independent of the U.S.-Israel relationship, which help us in fields other than the direct issue of Israel. So I think it's those three elements that seem to me to be the elements of the strategic relationship. As to what, Bob, you can take the rest.
I agree with all that. I'll be a little bit more irreverent. I think if we had an hour and a Harvard graduate student, we'd find that the United States has strategic relationships with about 70 countries, maybe higher. And then you ask, what's the content of it? And what was striking to Walt and I as we went through this project is, when we began was, well, we can find someplace, undoubtedly, that has the sort of list that Walt went over. We couldn't. And so we accumulated it from a variety of sources, essentially one at a time. And I think that's noteworthy because despite the term, much of the policy community hasn't thought of Israel as a strategic asset of the United States. And to demonstrate that fact, try and find an administration that has said that, rather than we have a strategic partnership, which, as I say, we have that with dozens and dozens of countries. And often it has very little content in it. The last thing I'd say is just, again, reinforcing something Walt said, which is, as we go forward, what we're really saying, you can, if you insist, you can go on using the word strategic partnership if you'd like. It's not one I favor, but if you'd like, it's free country. We'd like to give more content. That's what those recommendations are at the end, to the substance of that strategic relationship. We'd like, as we talk about it, a greater recognition of the way Israel, in the specific ways that Walt mentioned, serves our national interest. I do want to say here, and it's an important, maybe a paramount point, that in making this argument, we're not in any way seeking to diminish the power of the first two pillars, which are absolutely fundamental and transcending the democratic values and moral responsibility. But we think the third pillar should be included. On marketing, your ideas are welcome.
David Makovsky, up in front. Can you use the mic, please, David?
I was going to talk about the Dan Raviv question, which seems that since 9/11, and maybe with this administration as well, there's been more of an effort of trying to create political distance between Muslim communities and radical communities, and therefore it's not just about regimes but about peoples too since 9/11, and maybe this president also sees himself as a historic bridge in that regard. that he doesn't just think in terms of regime. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on this trend since 9/11. The other element is more maybe not as much asset liability as the issue of alignment, that a lot of Israel and America's enemies tend to overlap. I mean, that just as a lot of America is very concerned about Iranian encroachment in the Middle East, certainly so is Israel, Al Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and a lot of these Arab states know that if the U.S. would also walk away from this relationship that has been reaffirmed more than any other commitment, they could walk away from any commitment the United States has made. And frankly, are happy to see maybe Israel do some of their dirty work in confronting their own enemies. And so this isn't, I don't know, as an asset liability, but as that America's friends, Arab friends in the Middle East and Israel, have a kind of a similar strategic outlook in terms of who are destabilizing forces.
Gentlemen, comment?
I think that's in the category of the Harvard question, which then says, "Don't you agree?" As you know, those of you who've been at Harvard seminars, that's the question. Don't you agree? Let me say though, but because I don't entirely agree, that I think there's a lot to it. But I just say this: that what we sought to do, and when you get a chance to read the report, is not get inside the heads of Arab leaders, because I'm sure they have a variety of views and so forth. Our criterion was the actions that governments take, not what they tell our diplomats. And now we've had an opportunity to see how, through WikiLeaks, how American ambassadors and diplomats report in the Middle East and have for decades. And what they say is not every one of them, but the general theme is the U.S.-Israeli relationship bears serious costs for the United States in the region. So that's what they say. We haven't been able to identify any of them, and neither do they, actually, in these memoirs and telegrams. About the issue of peoples, again, I spent on and off my career at RAND when I wasn't in government or doing other things. It's extremely difficult to get any good data on recruitment for Al Qaeda and the role of the U.S.-Israeli relationship and the Palestinian issue and so forth. Walt and I both were served in Iraq, so I'm most familiar with that, and that is not part of the narrative of Al Qaeda Iraq. We also know that at least in the early days after 9/11, the Palestinian issue and the U.S.-Israeli issue did not figure largely in Osama bin Laden's public statements and Al Qaeda's. But it's very difficult to get at the actual data, and so when my Saudi friends say, which they do, well, you know, the U.S.-Israeli relationship and the Palestinian issue is the single best incentive for young Saudis to join terrorist organizations, I have no way to evaluate that. I'm not sure how much data they have, but I don't think that American policy should be affected by such a nebulous question. Or to put it differently, let's imagine we had that sustained crisis with Israel that I described earlier. Do you really think that substantially fewer young Arabs would join the terrorist network if they were so inclined and say, well, I was going to join it, but I guess I won't now? I'm really quite doubtful.
Yes, please.
Yes. I'm Natasha Mozgovaya from Haaretz newspaper. I was just curious to ask you about yesterday's vote at UNESCO when 107 countries basically vote against the U.S. position. Do you not consider it as a part of this price that the strategic relationship with Israel takes?
No.
Okay.
My answer is only slightly more complicated. There's no dispute that a lot of countries, including by no means all Arab countries, disagree with the United States and Israel about the Palestinian issue. And we're not claiming that that's not a real difference, and it produces different votes in the United Nations. That's not, in a sense, that's not the point. Of course, those differences exist, and they will be reflected in the actions of different countries. But that's not the whole of the relationship. And the argument is not that because the United States supports Israel and the Arabs, to put it mildly, mostly, and there'd be lots of qualifications to exactly what you mean by this, the Arabs don't. They do different things about views on the peace process, views on settlements, views on embargoes, and so on. That I think is hard to dispute. The issue is that it is very, very hard, and in our view, virtually impossible, to find instances in which the Arab countries have done things other than about the Arab-Israel dispute itself that have hurt U.S. interests and that they would do differently if it weren't for U.S. support for Israel.
Let me just add, and I was, of course, frivolous in my monosyllabic response, so let me just say a few more words, because I think it gives me the opportunity to say again, the optic that we looked through was U.S. national interests. And so do I think that that vote, which was as you described it, had a substantial effect on U.S. national interest? No, I don't.
Doug Fife. Can you use the mic, please, Doug?
Doug Fife of the Hudson Institute. Bob and Walt, your argument is a flat contradiction of, and it seems perhaps even an answer to, the Mearsheimer-Walt thesis in their work on the Israel lobby, which was premised on the idea that the United States has no national interest in support of no national interest that justifies the kind of U.S. support for Israel that we've given in over the decades. Well, I mean, I guess what I'd like you to comment on is how could they have reached the conclusion that they did in light of the conclusion that you've reached?
There is so much error in the world. Yeah, I mean, I think we have looked at what we see as the evidence. And, I mean, I think they, and there are others, people who know a lot about the region. I mean, I don't know about Walton Mearsheimer, but there are people who know a lot about the region who make the argument that, at best, this is a pure one-way street, an act of goodwill and charity that the United States confers on Israel. And I think our analysis shows that there are two fundamentally wrong things about that. One is the things I was saying, which there are, in fact, things the Israelis do for us. That doesn't mean Israel is more important to the United States than the United States is to Israel, but that it is in reasonable proportion a two-way street. The second, and I suppose in some ways a more fundamental answer, is that the United States has good national interest, security, strategic reasons, whatever adjective you want to use, for standing by a country like Israel. And I like to make the point, it's not the only small country that is exposed to potential enemies that we stand by, and certainly whatever the exact balance is, our support for Taiwan or South Korea or during the Cold War, Berlin, during at the time of 1991. Kuwait was pretty much something which was, they made very little contribution to their own defense. And yet it was very much in our national interest. We do not have alliances as acts of charity, when that we have them because they support our interests, which to some degree include it's not that it's to some degree it includes our values. It includes our values, but it also includes other more concrete interests, and that's true of Israel. I mean, you'll have to ask the people who make the contrary argument. I think it would be interesting to ask them whether they make the same contrary argument about the other countries to whom we also provide something like this kind of support. There are differences, but the principle is the same. Also, and you know far better than I, that ain't the only bad part of the Walt Mearsheimer analysis.
I just add that in the many discussions that Walt and I had in preparing the report, and in the innumerable emails going back and forth as we worked on the text, never once was that book mentioned. The report is not a response to that book. Hopefully the report will have, hopefully, a much longer lifespan than that particular book, or indeed anything that is written in a contemporary way, because the argument we're trying to make here is a very long-term argument, and it's not subject to what folks write today or tomorrow. We want the debate to be on the long-term proposition, not what happened last week or last month, and it has really nothing whatsoever to do with the Israeli lobby or Friends of Israel or whatever you want to call them. Nothing whatsoever. We never discussed that.
Ray Tanter.
Ray Tanter, adjunct fellow here at Georgetown University. I'd like to raise a question about the bureaucratic politics of implementing this idea, because when Doug Feith and I were on the NSC staff together in the 80s, we had a problem with state and defense with respect to how to implement this notion, and we worked on memorandum of strategic cooperation, and we were fought by state and the uniformed military, not by the undersecretary's office that much, not by the civilian side as much. So let's say that I buy, and I think several people in this room might buy the argument, and it does have the virtue of being true. How about implementing this in terms of the bureaucratic politics of getting state especially in line, but along with that, the uniformed military?
Obviously, that's an important practical question. I can only speak really for the military. It'd be interesting to know what other people who worked in the Pentagon like Doug think. My sense is, and as I think I mentioned, my sense is that the military-to-military relationship with Israel is much closer, much better, much more open than it was in the more distant past. I think it is certainly true that many American military officers who also get subjected to the criticisms of the United States' relationship with Israel make the point, which I think is hard to dispute, that if the United States, if the Israeli issue weren't there, I mean, forget exactly how it ended, if the Israeli issue weren't there, there wouldn't be this criticism and this rhetoric, and it'd be nice. But I think the thing which has changed in the last 30 years is from a situation in which the United States military and the had a very, very much an arm's length, suspicious relationship. There are a couple of things that the Israelis have done that have helped a lot with that. One is closing down the arms sales to China, and it's never totally perfect with anybody, closing down bases for allegations whether well-founded or not, of technology leakage. And I think those have had a salutary effect. And I mean, I guess part of the answer is insofar as there are practical things that can be done by the United States, by leadership, by instruction, or by Israel that make it possible to do more of this sort of thing, it ought to be done. As to changing the views of the State Department, I have no suggestion.
You're not going to touch that
I'm
one.
sorry, I don't mean to be that flip. I don't have a sense. First of all, I don't honestly have a sense that the State Department is in some kind of a massive opposition to a good relationship with Israel in any sense of the word. And I don't know that there are quite the concrete issues like the technology leakage and so on in the state.
Paul Berger, on my right.
My questions are kind of related. Is that kind of related to two previous questions? One, in your opinion, do the current policymakers of the United States share your conclusions concerning the strategic asset? And two, why does it appear that the policymakers in academia seem so distant in their own thinking from your conclusions?
The answer to your first question is, I don't know. I don't know, and they may have different views. What I do know is that, at least so far, administrations haven't been willing explicitly and in public to make this part of the argument for the U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, whether the reasons for that, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm not going to get into that. But they haven't yet done it. I hope they will. Just a brief reference to the earlier question about the State Department and the government. I think it is clear that whatever resistance exists in the State Department, if it does, and it probably does to some degree to this proposition, the only way that's going to change is with the Secretary of State. It's the only way. If you'll permit an aside, Doug Feith and I worked on the U.S.-India relationship and saw how enormously difficult it was to change the embedded views of the bureaucracy across the government about how to think about India. And that's now been going on for a decade, and it still hasn't accomplished its transcending objective. So, and it would not have happened without the president in particular on the U.S.-India relationship. So the president has a big role to play in this regard, what the president says and what he demands of his government in this regard. Whenever one tries to, at least my own experience as a washed-up Jedi Knight here, my own experience is that the kind of changes that are proposed in this report never are bottom-up, never. Because the bureaucracy likes to do today what it did yesterday, and it wants to do tomorrow what it did today. And by the way, there are some strengths to that. If you go into a emergency ward at the hospital, that's exactly how you want them to think, right? Not, well, look at him, he's bloody, what are we going to do, all right? So these have to be top down for sure. We hope that as time passes and we and others make this argument that in fact will happen.
Great. Do you want to address the academic side of the question?
No, I don't really. No.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Pavlos Anastasiadis, Ambassador of Cyprus to the United States. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your clarifying a pre-existing conception. May I ask you about the effect of regional developments and relationships that are developing or changing in the region, and how those might affect the value of Israel as a strategic asset for the United States and for promoting the U.S. interests. What I'm in the area, what I'm thinking about is the positive changes in the relationship between Israel and neighbors of Israel, which are not Muslim and are the only democracies in the region, particularly my own country. And we've seen recently warming up of an already close relationship that extends in a number of areas. Of course, the delimitation of the exclusive economic zones between Cyprus and Israel, the cooperation in the exploration and development of what everybody thinks very rich deposits of natural gas there, but also relationships in many other areas. Do you feel that these type of developments safeguard or even further enhance the value of Israel as a strategic asset for the United States? And by the same token, whether other changes that we see in regional relationships might undermine that, and as both Cyprus and Israel face threats emanating from the same source recently. Thank you.
Chris, I think that's such a thoughtful question that it's certainly going to be more thoughtful than my answer, without any doubt. But I'll, over time, try to reflect on it. I guess here's what I would say about it. First of all, praise be about the bilateral relationship between Cyprus and Israel, as you describe it. But we looked at the narrow, as I keep saying, the narrow question of U.S. national interests. Perhaps later we could discuss this. I'm not sure that that closer relationship it's good in and of itself. Presumably the Israelis value it, but we didn't look at what the Israelis value. That's not part of this exercise. So I'm not sure whether it furthers our national interest. It's good in and of itself, but I'm not sure it does. But while we're talking about that part of the Mediterranean, I think the Turkey-Israel relationship is interesting to think about in this context, because I've seen some commentators say that the United States is paying a price with Turkey for its relationship with Israel. And of course we know that Israel-Turkey relations are going through a difficult period. I think that would have been a more persuasive argument in the absence of the collaboration between the United States and Turkey with respect to Syria, which is extremely close, as you know. So that's another one of those issues, which is when we have looked at, Walt and I, the issue of what price is paid, we couldn't find one. So, and as for the way we started in your initial question, I think that's a terrific question. I'll think some more about it. And thank you for asking it, because I think conceptually it's important, not just your relationship with Israel.
Steve Rosen?
Just wanted to remind that this question of what price there would be for a expanded U.S. strategic relationship with Israel was right at the center of what Ray Tanter was talking about, President Ronald Reagan's decision to launch the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. That was the pivotal moment. And his Secretary of State, George Shultz, said the price would be limited. And his Secretary of Defense said the price would be very high. As a matter of fact, Caspar Weinberger argued that we would gain one ally and we would lose 25 from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, and if you included the Muslims, maybe to the Pacific Ocean. Years later, when the president decided against Weinberger and in favor of Shultz, and the relationship was launched and the sky didn't fall, a friend spoke to Weinberger about it and asked him in retrospect, why was the price so low? Or were you surprised?
And he admitted that he was surprised, and he said, I guess they thought we were in cahoots with Israel all along anyhow, so it didn't make that much difference. I believe that's close to a direct quote. And this has really not stopped. I think that inside the armed forces, in my experience, and in the bureaucracies of both the State Department and the Defense Department, this business of estimating the cost goes on to this day. So I think your study is a real contribution.
Don't you agree? I'll assume there's agreement. Richard.
Hi, Richard White's Hudson Institute. What developments could cause you to change your conclusions? What developments were all, and then implied in that is what do we need to do to make sure these developments don't happen, that we sustain a good net benefit in the relationship for both sides?
Interesting, gentlemen.
We didn't address that in the report, and I'm going to try, as we've been doing, to stick to the substance of the report. And I'm not now denigrating a good question, Richard, but we didn't address that in the report. And I don't think I could just say for the foreseeable future, I think the answer is 0 events that might happen, but maybe that's a failure of imagination on my part. But we didn't address it in the report.
Yes, sir. Can you use the mic?
I think I can.
Thank you.
My name is Greg Craig. I have a question, Bob, for you about something that I don't have to say, don't you agree? Because I think you both agree that there's a widespread perception that the U.S. does pay a cost, that the strategic relationship with Israel is a strategic liability. And the question I've got is that perception itself a strategic liability that does damage to our ability to operate in the world? And I think that your recommendation that we should make Israeli strategic importance to us a part of our declaratory policy recognizes that widespread perception that we suffer from the relationship does do damage to our ability to function. And so it's a difficult way of looking at it. But many people remember the period of time when there was Palestinian terrorism and American citizens were part of airliners that were being hijacked. And they could identify with specificity prices that American citizens were paying for the relationship with Israel. And that gets transported down, I think, through history so that almost every terrorist act in one way or another, whether it's an attack on a naval vessel or whether it's a blowing up of a barracks in Lebanon or whether it's a 9/11 attack, somehow gets blamed on our relationship with Israel. And it seems to me that's a real problem, that truth is important to get out there, but we've got to have a much more robust way of handling that widespread perception, because I think it does damage in our ability to make peace. It damages our ability to negotiate and help the peace process.
I do agree with that, Greg. I think that, and it's back to what we were saying earlier, as long as major parts of the government don't share this view and don't internalize it and it doesn't become part of their DNA, we all who have been in government know that they have many ways to, in fact, undermine the quality of the policy in the day-to-day sense. As I mentioned earlier about India, 10 years later, there are still people, especially the non-proliferation Ayatollahs, who are still seeking to undermine the very foundations of the relationship that 2 presidents now have endorsed. I'm not sure exactly how you get at it, except, as we've been saying, addressing it publicly and vigorously in a day-to-day sense. Because I think when you're trying to change attitudes, evidence matters. I'll just say one thing. We ventilated this report with a dozen or more people, some of whom agreed with it and some of whom didn't. but we appreciated all of their comments. But it was a wide spectrum of folks. And then subsequently have had conversations, and I don't want to overcharacterize this, but what I'm struck by when the force of the back half of the argument about do you pay a price is put, at least some people I've talked to, and I, in a typical Blackwillian way, am insistent that they answer the question, well, could you be more specific about what price the United States is paying for this? That being unable to do so, they get mad. No, they get mad. And I recently had a conversation with a very distinguished journalist who you all certainly know the name, who was reduced to saying to me, if you knew the Middle East as well as I did. And we know this is a very distinguished person, we know that's the last refuge, right? He can't think of any examples, so that's the last refuge. But I'm struck, this is a very emotional topic for a lot of people. I hope you'll agree that the report itself has a rather flat prose nature to it for that reason. We didn't want it to be incendiary. We try to use prose that is understated, if anything, and based on our best fact-finding. But this is going to be, and Greg is absolutely right, this is going to be a long-term slog. Because people, for ideological reasons, or professional reasons, or institutional reasons, will resist. Some resist. And again, I guess get back to the leadership, our political leadership in the White House, across the government, in the Congress, and we were up in the Senate this morning talking with senators who were saying the same thing, that this is going to be a long slog, but it's a slog that it seems to me is absolutely crucial for us to undertake, and to undertake it every day, because that's really the only way you change the lower intestines of public policy, is every day. It's not a speech. It's not one speech, two speeches. It's every day.
And Greg, if you do have suggestions on this, that would be very useful. In the back right, Dan Handel.
I think, Bob, last time we worked on an issue.
An issue was when the Israelis took out the Iraqi reactor. The Israelis have now taken out a Syrian reactor. So since part of your report is prospective, and having gone in Washington through the phase at the Pentagon of strategic dialogue, then there was strategic partnership, then it was now you're going to strategic asset. Let me try to do it this way. I have little doubt personally that the Arab world is absolutely and totally convinced that we're in cahoots with the Israelis. We have to be. After all, I was born in Israel, and I worked for you, Walt, and I worked with you, Bob. So, I mean, obviously, we've infiltrated the entire system. The one I'm sort of wonder about, I vividly recall working for Bud McFarlane and always wondering whether, if neither the Israelis, neither Begin nor the Iraqis had ever said a word about the Israelis taking out the Asuruk reactor, whether it would have been literally a tree falling in the forest. It took something like 28 hours for an announcement to be made that thing was taken out, that we knew about and how to sit on it. I guess my question is, if there is a strategic dialogue, a serious one, going on between the Israelis and the Americans with respect to Iran's nuclear program, I wouldn't rule out one of two possibilities. One possibility is that the Israelis can, well, three possibilities. We go on the current approach, do nothing. That's the easier one. Another alternative is the Israelis convince the Americans that this is something you guys have to do, and the U.S. puts together the, leading from the rear and has somebody do something. And the third option is the Israelis just do what
Begin decided to do on the Iraq one. It turned out that they had talked to us quite a bit about it, and we did nothing, so he decided to act. That we wake up one morning literally and find U.S. airplanes having taken out something. I'm not sure they could get everything, but they attack Iran. Just for the purposes of making the case a little harder, suppose the Iranians the next day attack U.S. forces in the Gulf. What does that do for your notion of Israel as a strategic asset?
Gentlemen?
And don't give me the answer, Walter, it's a hypothetical.
Well, part of the problem is that it is a hypothetical. And like most hypotheticals, it's very hard to answer conclusively unless you know the whole set of circumstances. To put it mildly, that was not, what would happen if the United States or Israel attacked Iran if Iran's programs got to whatever point was, to put it mildly, not the subject of our study. So I suppose I really shouldn't say anything, but I will give you my personal view. I can understand getting to the point. I think this question is much putting up the Israel doing it makes it too easy. The question is much easier to analyze if you ask the question: do you come to a point where the United States would want to do it, and then how do you weigh the consequences and so on? My view, and you are actually, if you're still at OSD, you're in a better position to answer this than I am. My impression is that there is no magic military solution to the problem. And as long as that's true, that's a fairly powerful, not strike magic, that there is no comprehensive, easy, get it over in a few days and it's over for a long time solution to the problem. As long as that is the case for using military force is pretty weak. If you assume that there is an answer, then I want to know the circumstances. I think it's important, and again, it's just my personal view on it. I honestly don't think Bob agrees with me, because we have occasionally discussed the issue. You might get to the point where you felt that it was essential to try to do something, and if you thought you could do something that was effective, you might do it. I think it is very important that we not rule out the possibility of military force, because you can't rule out getting to that situation in which you would decide there was a useful military objective, a useful military option, and it was worth the consequences. I think it's important not to rule it out, but I also think you shouldn't have the illusion that, well, we'll just play along for a little while and then we'll go and we'll have some surgical strike which will solve the problem for us.
Let me just add one thing, which is in the report, which is you can think of innumerable contingencies here on the Iranian nuclear program, but surely as Iran goes on as rapidly as it can to try to acquire nuclear weapons capability, it's in the interest of the United States to have the closest possible intelligence relationship with Israel. And what I'm told by our intelligence community is that estimates regarding the Iranian nuclear program are now quite close on the part of the two governments and the two intelligence communities, which, as you know, was not the case 5 years ago. But as we go forward, that's an absolutely essential part of the American calculations as to the options available as Iran continues its nuclear weapons capability, is this asset of Israeli intelligence as we try to think what to do about that program. And since that, in my judgment, the Iranian nuclear program is the most consequential danger to the United States today in the Middle East by several magnitudes, then having the benefit of Israeli intelligence on that subject is a major issue, a major advantage, a major benefit for American national interests.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both. I think in your very understated way, and I think when you read the report, you will see this is not this is not trumpeting from the mountaintops, but this is an understated understated report. In your very understated way, I think you've made a very provocative and powerful argument. And so I want to thank you very much.